I have kind of a weird story to tell. I've only ever told one person, as honestly, I didn't realize how strange the entire situation was until I brought this up to a friend of mine. This happened a few months ago, and at the time, I had just recently been fired from my job. I had been working there for several years, and so the abrupt firing caught me by surprise. I thought everything had been going all right for me, but just like that, they told me to pack up my things and leave right away. Honestly, it made me feel pretty bad. Rather than spend some time trying to find another job immediately, I spent a few weeks moping around my house and not doing much of anything. I had lost both the strength and the will to do anything, especially look for a new job, though at that dark point in my life, one of my close friends tried to help me out. This friend reached out, telling me that a position at one of her other friends' companies had opened up recently. It was nearly the same as the one I'd been fired from, so right away it seemed I'd hit the jackpot. All seemed perfect, though there was still something in my mind saying this was a little bit strange. My friend, who I won't name for privacy's sake, had always been a little bit on the shady side. Maybe they just weren't the most open person to talk to, or maybe they were just simply reserved, but there always seemed to be something a little bit off about them. For the sake of my future, as well as a potential job opportunity though, I put that out of my mind and focused on applying. In just a short time, I'd gotten out of my slump pretty fast and was preparing for this new job and a new start as well. My friend sent me the phone number of the company and told me the hours I would be able to call them at. I woke up as early as possible on the day I was going to give them a call, readying myself for the always nerve-wracking interview I was about to have. When the time was right, I called the company, and before I knew it, I was connected to your average phone-answering secretary, it seemed. The fake peppy voice she put on made me feel that I'd had the right number straight away, and I told her the reason I was calling. She was quick to begin asking questions afterward, taking in all my basic information. Name, phone number, just like every other company did as standard procedure. I replied with all the information she was seeking, along with answering a few more filtering personal questions she asked, like what experience I had and any prior jobs I'd had as well. I sat on the call for some time answering her questions before she said she'd gotten all the information she needed out of me. At the end of the call, she informed me that 2 days from then, I could come in for an in-person interview. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting still for a few moments after. I was as happy as I could be. After going through such a tough time unexpectedly, it felt like I was really getting somewhere. It was easy to say I was ecstatic about getting an interview. Thus, I spent the next few days preparing before the day was finally here. I woke up early, got dressed in my finest. A black suit over a button-up shirt underneath, along with a pair of fine dress pants. I went the full 9 yards with everything that morning, as I knew I had to be my best for any interview. I pepped myself up the entire time as well, until I was finally ready to leave. Still though, I was really nervous. I took a few deep breaths before leaving the house. I got into my car and started heading to the address. I remember the drive actually wasn't too far away, only about 10 minutes or so. As I got closer though, it began to feel as if my destination was hours away. I got closer to the address, and my nerves got even worse. I had been through many interviews before, and the thought of one more shouldn't have made me as nervous as I was. It got the best of me during the car drive, and I was completely caught up in them. Before I even realized I'd pulled right into a parking space of where my GPS had told me to go. As I parked, I came to my senses and realized where I was. I managed to get even more nervous as I realized this. I wanted to go home and forget about this interview, as I thought about how unexpectedly my last job had ended. Still though, I shook him off and looked at where my GPS had taken me. I stepped out and looked at the building in front of me. Instead of what I assumed was going to be a typical office space or something, there was a gigantic run-down building in front of me. I remember staring at every inch for some time. All the windows were either broken or boarded up completely. The coloring of the bricks was faded as well, and there wasn't even a front door on the place. I began to think that I simply had the wrong address, but my GPS confirmed this seemed to be the correct destination. I even checked the address I'd typed in multiple times. Each time I looked, the numbers were the same and correct. I realized that this really seemed to be the right place. My mind was all over the place in this moment. My nerves about the interview were gone, although in their place was a whole new set of anxiousness. I went closer to the building to inspect it. I had to see for myself that the building was the right one before I decided to leave. As I approached, I was stopped by someone coming out from the side of the building, a man in a reflective high-visibility jacket. "Hey, what are you doing here? This is a construction zone," the man yelled. I was even more confused. I understood what he meant though when I walked closer to him and caught a peek around the other side. It was indeed a construction crew with tons of heavy machinery just sitting there. "Oh, sorry, I thought this was the place for my interview. I was looking for so-and-so, but it seems I have the wrong place." No, this is so-and-so, but I don't know what interview you're going to be having here. The building's been abandoned for a few decades," the man said. My face turned to shock, and I got even more of a headache from the situation. "But I called a few days ago. Someone answered and said she was with a company called so-and-so." The man stared at me. "I don't know who's trying to fool you here, but this building did belong to that company back in the day. They haven't been around for a few decades, though. Now get along there. The building's supposed to be demolished today, and my guys have to get back to work," the man said again. I could do nothing but leave. The company seemingly didn't exist anymore. It seemed like I'd been the victim of some sort of cruel prank at the hand of whoever was on the other line. But something put me off. The call had seemed so legitimate. The girl on the other line had certainly fooled me for being a secretary of some company. I didn't think much more of it, though. The man had said the company I was trying to join hadn't existed in that place in decades. Just like that, I was back to square one. No job and no interview. The drive back home was long and silent. It hardly even fazed me just how weird the encounter had been, as all I could think about was now I wasn't even able to have that much to be excited about. I got home and went right back to where I'd started. I holed up in my house for a couple of weeks, not having the motivation to do anything, as I once again found myself in a depressive episode. As more time went by, I slowly healed again, and found the will to look for a job once more. This was several months ago, mind you, and since then I fixed myself even more. I was able to find a new job, much better for my own health than the one I'd been fired from. Over the several months in between this story I just told and now, I'd been so focused on my new job and working hard enough to keep it that the situation had gone through and slipped my mind entirely. It wasn't up until the point that I told my friend the entire story of what happened to me that I realized just how strange it was. When I informed my friend the number they had given me, I realized it was actually incorrect from the one she'd meant to give me. She apologized a lot after realizing her mistake and ended up giving me the actual phone number, which is actually how I found my current job. The fact of what I had gone through was still up for question. I had accidentally been given a wrong number, but was put through to a seemingly real company. On top of that, I even got told to come in for an interview to a real address, and for a real company that once existed, even if it no longer did. The whole situation is just kind of a big mystery to me. My friend and I threw out many ideas, some that were pretty ordinary like a simple prank call, and some that were farther out. You know, some like how I could have gone through an insane phenomenon like time travel through a phone call or something. Some of the ideas were of course ridiculous, and even now I have no clue what happened to me on that day. This happened to me just a few weeks ago. I've dwelled on telling this story to anyone that wasn't close to me over that time, and now I believe that I'm doing well enough to come out about what happened. I, 24 and female, have been living on my own for several years now. I settled into my own house shortly after finishing college. I hadn't had any major problems with the house so far, and everything seemed to be great all around. On top of that, the neighborhood I settled into was amazing as well. All my neighbors were very lovely, and I was able to interact with all of them and become somewhat close. It seemed like I had found a place I could live in forever. There wasn't a single problem in sight, at least until one of my neighbors that I had grown close to over the time I'd spent in that house moved away one day. At first, my neighbor leaving was nothing more than an unfortunate life event. Sure, I would miss them, but there wasn't much I could do about it, and it wasn't as if something horrific had happened to them and I'd never hear from them again. Them leaving, though, was just the start of the problem, as what was brought in their vacancy was far worse than I could have ever suspected. When my neighbor found a home elsewhere, they had put their house up for sale, and over the coming weeks, many people came and went in and out of the house. First off were the movers, removing everything that my neighbors had told them to before putting them up in their new home. Once everything was out, it was time to sell off the house, which brought in people that were looking to move. Tons of people were moving in and out daily, as it seemed like the area I had moved into was quite the hot commodity. I watched as families, couples, and even rich singles walked in and out of the house every day. Cars lined the street as the same female realtor walked them all through the house one by one. This went on for quite some time. I would go to work when the people began to pour in and look around, and when I came back around the time when it finished up, the last groups were just getting done with their tours. One particular day I came home, and just like any other, people were getting in their cars and leaving as the street cleared out for the day. As I walked up to my front door, though, I realized that the realtor and a viewer were having a conversation on the front lawn. I let them be as they talked, until I noticed that both of their gazes were now fixated upon me. I looked back at them as they waved over to me. Like any normal person would, I gave a polite wave back before going back inside my house. I really didn't think that much about it at the time, but the viewer that I had waved to was a little bit unsettling to look at. Something about them just set me off slightly. I didn't really give it much mind though, especially since I figured I would never see them again. Hundreds of people had viewed the house, and chances of him buying it seemed slim to me. With this thought in my head, I went about my night before going to bed. When I woke up the next morning though, something was different. As I prepared to leave for work, there was no bustle of cars outside the house next door. No group after group going inside and looking around. There was silence. It was nice, but that silence meant something. The house had been sold off, as there was now a sold sticker over the sign on the front lawn. That wasn't much for me to think about for the time being, other than wondering who my new neighbors were going to be. I at least hoped they were going to be up to the standard of my last ones. I went to work, and at the end of the day when I came back home, I had my very first encounter with my new neighbor. I walked inside, enjoying the silence of the house next door. I sat down at my kitchen table, grabbing something to eat from my fridge. When I sat down, I looked over at that house next door and saw someone inside. They were surveying the room they were in before they glanced out their window. I remember the piercing glare they hit me with as the eyes of the man from the other day met my own. Even though he was glaring at me, somehow the look on his face still managed to be quite friendly, and thus I gave a forced smile and a slight wave. I was shocked to see that man from before inside the house now, but that only meant one thing. My new neighbor was him. It made me feel a little bit strange, honestly, but maybe that was just the impression I was getting from him. Didn't want to judge a book by its cover. Besides, he seemed to be really nice. That's what I told myself in my head at least, as I tried to get that original strange encounter with him out of my mind. Little did I know I would be seeing his gaze a lot more after that first encounter with him, partly because he was going to move in very shortly thereafter. After that day, he was at his new house daily, moving in his stuff with the help of movers and other workers. I went about the next week as if it was any other, with the only difference being that instead of people coming to view the house and it being noisy, there was a man next door moving in being noisy at all hours of the day. On top of that, he always seemed to be gazing at me, his eyes always tracking mine. Each time he would give a friendly wave before going on about his day and continuing what he was doing, as if it had never happened. This went on until just about a week and a half after he had bought the house, as he'd fully moved into it now. I tried to tell myself the man was very friendly, but something about him still put me on edge when I was around him. With nothing else to do, I would welcome him to the neighborhood and go over to his house myself with a small gift. It was a good thing to do as a neighbor in the first place. Without a real plan, I went over next door and introduced myself, as well as scoped out the person I had so many suspicions about. In all honesty, it went perfectly fine. He graciously accepted my gift and introduced himself kindly as my new neighbor. I introduced myself right back. It was such a pleasant, normal interaction that I immediately wrote off all my suspicions of him being anything other than a completely normal guy. Maybe I'd actually be able to get along with him as well as my last neighbors. He didn't seem like someone I'd have to be wary of, at the very least. After introducing myself, the days between us went on even more normally. I saw him a few times. I saw him very little actually, aside from sometimes when I came or left from work. Even then, all we'd do was wave, say hi, and casually chat for a bit. I slowly saw a change, however, as I began to see my neighbor more and more frequently. It started with him being outside when I came home more and more, to the point where it was almost daily. It wasn't that out of place, I guess, but it still stuck in the back of my mind. Then it turned into seeing him before I left almost every day as well. It didn't stop there either. I began to see him out my window in the early mornings. I would catch him facing the direction of my house before he cracked his signature friendly smile. It got progressively worse too. I began to see him staring at me out the window more and more. I got more and more creeped out until one event finally broke me. I came home from work one evening, and to my surprise, he was not out in front of his house waiting to wave at me like always. I went inside and decided to do a few things before heading to bed. Ate, watched some TV, waited for a few hours to pass before I felt tired enough to hit the hay. Not before I took my dog out for its nightly walk though. The weather was just starting to get nicer, and I had been regularly walking him around the neighborhood for about 15 minutes or so each night. It was a nice routine. I grabbed up his leash and the two of us stepped outside. There was a little excitement on these walks, as usually everyone was in bed around the time we went out. It was much nicer this way. The silence of the night was something I greatly enjoyed, even if it was only for 15 minutes a day. Eventually, our walk came to an end as we rounded the corner that led back to my house. I remember looking into the house next to mine as I walked past. My neighbor always seemed to be asleep at this time of night, as there were no lights on inside of his house. That stayed the same today, though even with no lights on, I still felt something from the house, as if my neighbor was staring at me somehow. Even though all his windows were closed with the curtains drawn in front of them, and there was no visible light inside, I could still feel his piercing gaze. I tried to push that feeling out of my mind. I looked toward my own house and picked up the pace slightly. Eventually, I made it inside. I shut the door behind me in a hurry as I leaned my back against it, staying still for a few moments while recovering myself. I remember panicking hard, having to catch my breath. I quickly did and went on to try and get some sleep. I got all ready for bed, but was stopped in my tracks when I entered my bedroom to finally lay down. Across the way from my room and my neighbor's window, he was standing there, staring into my room as I got ready to lay down. He smiled and waved at me like he always did. I remember panicking and running out of my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I wasted no time running to each other door and making sure they were already locked. I shut every blind and curtain I had on my windows and completely sealed myself in. I wanted to sleep, but fear kept me awake, and I didn't sleep a wink that night. Eventually, the sun shone through the cracks in the blinds, and I could tell it was now morning. The subtle light in the room made me feel a bit safer, although I knew I was not out of the woods yet. With the sunlight creeping in, I calmed myself down. I was composed enough to tell someone what happened. I messaged a group chat with my closest friends and let them know what was going on. A few of them offered to come over immediately or even call the police for me, though I had no actual evidence my neighbor was doing anything of ill intent. Thus, I took one of my friends up on their offer to stay over. He was one of my closest guy friends, and the person I probably trusted most to help me out in this situation. He said he was coming over soon. I spent the time waiting for him to come over by calling my work and letting them know what was going on, and I would be taking the day off that day. A little time passed before I could hear my friend's car outside as he pulled into my driveway. A knock at the front door followed as I went to open it. I made sure the person I was letting in was my friend. I felt some stress lifted off my shoulders as I let him in. We sat down on my couch as I sprawled out on it before passing out almost instantly. The comfort I felt from having someone around made me fall asleep right away, and I was finally able to put my worries out of my mind. I woke late into the night as I got my usual amount of rest and then some. I woke up completely disoriented as well, almost unable to tell where I was. It was one of the best rests I'd had in a while. It was around 8 p.m. when I woke up. My friend told me when I had gotten more oriented, and I thanked him for staying with me while I slept. He wanted to stay for the rest of the night. I took him off on his offer, though I wasn't that tired whatsoever. We stayed up together and watched TV. This went on around an hour or so, before it was time for my nightly walk with the dog. Usually I would get ready to go right away, but tonight I was second-guessing myself on if I should or not. Ultimately, I went against it, much to the dismay of my dog, who didn't seem to be very happy. It was for the best, though. With nothing else to do except go back to watching TV, we did just that. My dog didn't seem to want to sit still, though. He kept on pacing around the house. My dog went on to do this for about 20 minutes, until he started whining repeatedly. It started out quietly at first, but soon picked up until the point where we could no longer ignore him. I went to check on what my dog was whining about. I found him pacing around a room near a window wall, one that he could see out of, as he seemed to direct me toward the window. I got closer, as he began to bark louder and louder. I almost yelled at him for barking so late at night, before I realized the reason he'd been going off the whole time. I crept up towards him, picked him up in my arms, and then I caught a glance out the window at what he'd been barking at. My eyes went wide with surprise, and I felt almost sick as I saw the figure of my new neighbor huddled tight against the wall of my house. He seemed to be waiting for something, as every few moments he poked his head out of his hiding spot. It didn't seem like he'd seen I'd noticed him yet. I immediately ran to get my friend, trying to stay as quietly as possible so as to not alert the man outside. I got to my friend and urged him to come with me to the window. My neighbor was still there when I got back, huddled against the wall and waiting for something. It was then that I realized what he'd been waiting for, the reason I felt him staring at me every night I'd gone out with my dog. He was waiting for me to head down the path back home. I felt sick thinking of what could have happened to me if I had gone out that night. I retreated further into the house as my friend began to video the neighbor outside. He made sure to get his face included as well, clearly showing that he was on my property without permission. We followed up by calling the police and quietly reporting the man waiting outside. We waited for what felt like an eternity before we heard the sirens outside and saw the flashing blue and red lights. We checked back on my neighbor's hiding spot, and we saw he had moved, though we hadn't seen where he'd gone to. The police were still approaching. Then we heard multiple bangs coming from the front door, along with the man yelling. I instantly knew it was the neighbor. I don't want to recite the things he said from the other side of the door, as I've tried tirelessly to push them out of my mind entirely. The banging continued until the sound of other voices could be heard outside. I could tell the police had finally arrived. Sometime after the situation had died down outside, one of the cars could be heard leaving my house, but another remained. Another knock at the door came, this time from a police officer. The officer asked some questions about what was going on. After we told him we'd called and I gave him the rundown of the situation and what happened in the days leading up to this point, I was trembling through it all as I held the fear inside of me from the encounter. After answering all the questions, we showed him the video of the man hiding next to my house, waiting for me. I also told him what I thought was going on. I'm glad the officer took the time to hear everything out that I had to say. He even wrote down most of it before leaving to report what I'd told him. He told me I didn't have to go to the station to give further information if I didn't want to. In the end, I didn't want to. I didn't want there to even be a chance of seeing my neighbor again. I went back inside where I fell asleep quickly on the couch, along with my friend, as he hadn't slept a wink the entire time he'd been with me. We got a nice long rest before we woke up the next morning. Little information came out about what happened until a few days later. We got word he'd been charged with trespassing, an attempt at breaking and entering. They said he would likely get very little jail time for this, but we could still get a restraining order against him. If he ever came close to me again, he'd be charged and sentenced to far more jail time than he was going to be serving now. This put me at ease a little bit. It felt like delayed comfort, as I knew a restraining order could mean very little to someone who didn't care to obey the law. That was, for the most part, my entire story, as at present time, my neighbor still sits behind bars for a little bit. Now, the house next door has picked right back up with what had been happening a few weeks prior. The commotion started once more, as people poured in the hopes of living there again. I'm kinda sick of the noise they were making daily, but that's not the worst thing for me. All I care about is that hopefully I get a better neighbor next time. This happened in New York City. Years ago, when I was a freshman in college, I was out partying one night with some friends. I wasn't drunk or on any hard drugs or anything, but I definitely smoked a blunt or two. Around 3 a.m., we decided to go our separate ways. I got off the train and began my long walk home. I had to take an even longer route home that night too, because some of the train lines happened to be under maintenance. When I got off the train, I realized I would have to walk past the cemetery, and I started to feel a bit uneasy. I wasn't afraid for any particular reason though. It was about 10 blocks and then I'd be home. I always saw trucks lined up on the cemetery blocks, and it being a desolate area, I assumed it was truckers parking their trucks by the cemetery to take naps or sleep before continuing on their routes. Back then, I didn't really give it much thought. A few minutes after getting off the train and starting my walk though, I heard the faint sound of what I guessed to be a car or truck door being shut behind me. I turned around, but in the darkness, I couldn't see anything. I tried to scan my surroundings once quickly. I didn't see anyone ahead of or behind me as far as my eye could see. I kept walking, this time a bit faster, and about a minute later, I began to hear footsteps behind me. I turned around so quick, I swear I could have snapped my own neck. I saw a man walking swiftly just a few feet behind me. When he saw me turn around, he began catcalling me by making kissing noises. I was used to these sorts of things, especially living in New York City. By my house, there was always a line of men on the corner every morning, waiting to be picked up for construction work. Every time I passed them to go to the store, I would get catcalled and harassed. Because of this, I simply ignored the man and kept walking. Definitely faster this time though. Only a few seconds later, he was sprinting to catch me. He was now at my side, speaking to me in Spanish, a language which I don't speak. He grabbed my arm tightly enough to leave bruises and began pulling me towards him. I started screaming and fighting him off. He pushed me up against the cemetery fence. In the midst of this, my heart sunk to the floor. I thought I was about to be ripped or worse. Seconds later, he had me off my feet by both arms, when suddenly his face turned white in the moonlight. A look of terror passed his face as he looked past me into the cemetery, seemingly fixated on something ahead. He let out a blood-curdling scream and let me go. As I dropped to the floor, he was already sprinting across the street and running out of sight, choking on tears and shaking. Beside myself, I picked myself up and ran so fast the last few blocks to my house. I didn't dare to turn and look back into that cemetery. I didn't turn around at all. I didn't stop until I was home. I never took that train or walked past that cemetery again. To be honest, I never told my parents either. I only told a handful of friends over the years, because to this day, I still don't understand exactly what happened. All I know is that something in that cemetery probably saved my life that day. It's taken so long for me to finally be able to tell this story, because whenever I do, people seem to be underwhelmed, I guess. This was a terrifying experience for me. I can only imagine people find it to be so unbelievable it's kind of hard to sympathize with. Anyway, this was 2 years ago in the summer. I had this coworker I was friends with, and he asked me to hang out around 11 p.m. I told him I was busy and had to walk my dog. I really wasn't in the mood to hang out, but he ended up somehow convincing me anyways. So he gets to my house and we drive to this park about 10 minutes away. We sit on the swing set and talk for a while. We ended up talking about some creepy stuff, so I think we kind of spooked ourselves from the content of our conversation naturally. A bit of time later, I suggested we go to a drive-thru. We both got up to leave the park and walked to his car, which was parked on the side of the street. As we were walking, we noticed a man also walking on the sidewalk. We both mentioned to each other how we'd seen him in the park earlier as well. He creeped us out a bit since he seemed to be watching us, but we really didn't think anything else after he went away. If I remember properly, the man was walking past our car down the sidewalk. We were walking straight to get into the car. We were about 6 or so feet away from him when he turned around and started walking straight towards us. My friend hadn't even had the time to unlock his car doors before the man started screaming. "Are you fucking serious?" We had no clue why he'd be yelling at us like this, so we kinda just stood there frozen beside our car doors. I started to jiggle the passenger door and look at my friend. The man started to get closer, so we knew we had to run. I can't explain how our thought process worked in this moment, because we weren't saying anything to each other. Our instincts just kinda both kicked in after the initial shock wore off. My friend ran the same way the man had been walking before he turned around, and I ran the other way. The man chased after my friend. I kinda half jogged, half stayed in one spot, trying to figure out if my friend was about to be killed by this crazy guy or what. I screamed in their direction I was calling the police, but the guy didn't even skip a beat and kept on yelling and rambling into the night. I'm a girl and my friend was a guy, so I think naturally he wanted to get the guy away from me or something. In that moment, I thought my friend was going to be killed, and the man would come back for me after. Keep in mind, we were on a street on one side of the park. There were houses all lined on this street, and not one person called the police or checked to see if we were okay. My flight kicked in, and I ran behind someone's house to hide in their backyard while I called 911. The funny part is, after explaining the situation and how we were being chased by a man saying he was going to kill us both, the 911 operator asked where I was and told me I needed to leave the backyard in case I scared the owners. I was literally hiding so I don't die, but the operator said, "Nah, go back into his line of sight so you're not hiding on someone's private property." Anyway, I heard my friend yell my name. It took me a minute to come out, but I finally did. He told me the man had run off, and the police showed up soon after. They took our statements, but didn't really seem too concerned. He put his searchlight on the cruiser and just drove around the area. Literally after the police had already left, a woman came out of her house and told us she saw the whole thing. Told me the guy was screaming he was going to rip our corpses after he killed us, and she was so scared for us. Oh, thanks. Anyway, that's my story on how we thought we were being chased by a madman who was saying he was going to rape and murder us. We thought other people would care, but nah, they just stayed inside their house and didn't even call the police for us. Please take this as advice to always watch your own back and never expect other people to have your best interest in mind. Nobody cared about us, and we were teenagers running for our lives in a public park. People are assholes, and most of the time bystanders, making them nearly as bad as the guy that was chasing us. The police didn't seem to give much of a shit either. Private property was more important than my life.